Before we begin, please click on the like button and subscribe to our channel. One waitress, a conceited millionaire, and a grand piano. What began as an attempt to put her down transformed into a breathtaking moment that stunned everyone and deflated egos. You won't believe how she reversed the situation with nothing but her talent. It was a balmy Friday evening, and the air was filled with the buzz of conversations at the Meridian, an upscale restaurant nestled in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina. The sound of glasses clinking, the soft footsteps of waitstaff, and the distant melody of jazz from a corner piano set the stage for an atmosphere of elegant indulgence. Clara, a 25-year-old waitress with a quiet demeanor and a spark in her eye, moved effortlessly between tables, balancing plates and offering smiles. To most diners, she was just another face in uniform, but deep inside, she carried dreams far larger than the luxurious space around her. Clara's passion wasn't serving food, it was music. Ever since childhood, the piano had been her sanctuary, a place where she could express every joy, sorrow, and unspoken feeling. But dreams don't pay the bills. Working long hours at the Meridian was a necessity, a stepping stone to the prestigious music school she hoped to attend one day. Few knew of her talent except for the restaurant staff, who sometimes caught her sneaking in a few notes on the old upright piano in the back during her breaks. That evening, as the dinner rush began to slow, the door swung open, and in walked Harrison Blackwell. Immediately recognizable, the wealthy mogul made an entrance that commanded the room. Surrounded by a few equally polished associates, Harrison radiated an air of arrogance. Known for his biting remarks and love for drama, his presence made even the most experienced staff stand a little taller. Clara's colleagues exchanged knowing glances. Harrison was not an easy guest. He was the type who thrived on pushing people's buttons. For Clara, however, he was just another customer to serve on a long night. But this would turn out to be no ordinary evening. As Harrison scanned the room, his gaze settled on Clara. Something about her piqued his interest. A brief pause, followed by a smirk. Clara felt the weight of his stare but ignored it, focusing instead on her duties. But Harrison had already decided she would be his entertainment for the evening. Clara had grown up in a small town in Georgia, where aspirations of grandeur often felt as unreachable as the stars. Her mother, a single parent working tirelessly as a nurse, had juggled double shifts to make sure Clara and her siblings had food on the table. Despite their humble circumstances, music had always been a constant in their home. Her mother's worn vinyl records and the off-key piano given to them by a neighbor were the beginnings of Clara's love for music. That piano became her refuge. While other children played outside, Clara spent countless hours teaching herself to play. She would imitate songs on the radio and gradually explore classical compositions from second-hand sheet music. Her talent never went unnoticed. She played at church, school events, and local gatherings. Yet, recognition couldn't overshadow the financial obstacles that stood in the way of her dreams. By the time she turned 18, the reality was clear. A professional music career would have to wait. Scholarships didn't materialize, and family responsibilities took priority. Clara put aside her concert aspirations, trading them for the practicality of earning a living. Still, she couldn't fully abandon her love for music. The piano was more than just a dream, it was part of who she was. When Clara moved to Charleston a few years ago, she sought out a job at the Meridian, not only for the pay but because of the grand piano tucked into the corner of the restaurant. Though she rarely had time to play, just knowing it was the piano that gave her comfort. Music hadn't left her. It was simply waiting for the right moment. That evening, as Harrison and his entourage took their seats, Clara approached their table, balancing a tray with practiced ease. Harrison ordered a top-shelf whiskey and cracked a joke loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Clara offered a polite smile as she took their orders, her voice steady despite the strange energy emanating from him. "Clara, huh?" Harrison said, glancing at her name tag. "Sounds like someone with hidden talents." The remark caught her off guard, but she nodded politely and stepped away to deliver their orders. She didn't notice the knowing grin he shared with his companions or the way his eyes tracked her every movement. But Harrison wasn't just observing. He was scheming, and Clara was about to find herself at the center of a spectacle she never asked for. The night continued as usual, with laughter and the clink of silverware filling the air. Clara kept a steady pace, avoiding Harrison's gaze as she moved between tables. She'd dealt with difficult customers before, but something about him felt different. He wasn't just rude, he was calculating. His presence lingered like a shadow, making her uneasy in a way she couldn't quite explain. By the time the appetizers were served, Harrison had already started his performance, though not the kind Clara expected. He regaled his table with tales of his success, tossing in jabs about those who lacked ambition. His companions laughed obediently, while other diners shot annoyed glances in his direction. Clara tried to stay focused on her work, but when she returned to their table with a bottle of wine, Harrison caught her off guard. "Tell me, Clara," he said, his voice sharp above the noise. "What do you do when you're not carrying trays? A young woman like you must have big dreams." His words stopped her in her tracks. Clara hesitated, then gave a measured reply. "I play piano sometimes," she said quietly, hoping to keep it brief. Harrison's eyes sparkled, and a sly smile appeared on his lips. "A pianist, huh? How interesting. Why don't you give us a little performance?" Clara froze. The room seemed to fall silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "Oh, I couldn't," she said quickly, forcing a nervous laugh. "I'm just here to work tonight." But Harrison wasn't about to let it slide. "Nonsense," he declared, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "There's a piano right there in the corner. Show us what you've got. Surely someone with your potential isn't shy in front of a crowd." His companions chuckled, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Other patrons turned their heads, curious about the commotion. Clara's chest tightened. She could feel the weight of their stares, the quiet judgment in the air. She wanted to say no, to walk away, but Harrison's challenge hung between them, daring her to either accept it or back down. "I really shouldn't," Clara stammered, scanning the room for some support. But even her co-workers seemed reluctant to step in. Harrison leaned back in his chair, sipping his whiskey with a self-satisfied smirk. "Ah, I see," he mocked. "All talk, no talent. How disappointing." The word stung like a slap. Clara's hands clenched at her sides. She wasn't the type to seek conflict, but the way he dismissed her, like she was nothing, just a joke, hit harder than she expected. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't let anyone make you feel small, Clara. You're more than they'll ever understand." A heavy silence settled between them. Clara glanced at the piano, then back at Harrison. His smug grin dared her to take the bait, and against her better judgment she did. "Fine," she said, her voice steady but low. "I'll play." The room tensed with anticipation as Clara walked toward the piano, each step heavy with both fear and defiance. The dining room seemed to hold its breath as she approached the polished grand piano. The chandelier above cast a soft spotlight on her, separating her from the murmuring crowd. Her fingers trembled as she settled onto the bench, the keys gleaming like a challenge. Behind her, Harrison leaned back, clearly pleased with himself, as though he'd already won whatever game he was playing. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Her heart raced so loudly she could barely think. This wasn't a local recital or a quiet gathering. This was different, hostile. But there was no turning back now. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling their cool surface. The first notes were soft, hesitant, almost fragile. A few diners shifted in their seats, and someone coughed in the distance. Clara ignored them, focusing as the music began to take shape. She chose a piece she knew by heart, a soulful rendition of Clair de Lune by Debussy. The melody filled the room, flowing through the air like a delicate but powerful thread. As her confidence grew, the music swelled. Her hands moved with a grace that contrasted the storm inside her, the notes spilling out like a secret finally set free. Each note seemed to carry a piece of her journey, the sacrifices her mother made, the countless hours spent practicing in a cramped apartment, the weight of dreams put on hold but never forgotten. The room fell into silence, the buzz of conversation fading into a collective stillness. Even Harrison, who had been murmuring to his companions, went quiet. Clara didn't need to look at him to feel the change in the atmosphere. The earlier mocking energy had vanished, replaced by something she couldn't quite place. Maybe awe, maybe humility. The music soared, and Clara surrendered to it. For the first time in what felt like ages, she wasn't just a waitress or a struggling dreamer. She was simply herself, an artist. Her fingers flew over the keys, each note a vivid, emotional expression that seemed to hang in the air, raw and unfiltered. By the time the final note rang out, the room was still. For a moment there was no sound, only the lingering echo of the piano. Clara remained motionless, her hands still resting on the keys, uncertain of what would happen next. Then, as though breaking free from a trance, the room erupted into applause. The sound was overwhelming, filling the space with warmth Clara hadn't expected. Some diners stood, clapping with such enthusiasm it brought tears to her eyes. Her co-workers, who had been watching from the sidelines, joined in, their faces beaming with pride. Harrison, however, remained seated. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by an unreadable expression, part surprise, part discomfort. He raised his hands and clapped slowly, his applause feeling hollow compared to the roar around him. But even his reluctant clapping couldn't overshadow what Clara had just accomplished. She had reclaimed her voice, and no amount of condescension could take that from her. As the applause began to fade, the room seemed to collectively exhale. Clara slowly rose, her knees shaking but her posture firm. She looked around and, for the first time that evening, truly saw the people who had watched her, not as onlookers but as witnesses. Their faces held something new: admiration, respect, and even a trace of awe. She didn't look at Harrison immediately. Instead, she gave a small, polite nod to the diners who had clapped the most, offering a faint smile. It wasn't pride that filled her, but relief. Relief that she hadn't let fear silence her. But then, as if drawn by an invisible force, her gaze shifted to Harrison. He was still sitting, his hands folded in front of him on the table. The confident smirk he had worn so boldly earlier was gone, replaced by a face of forced neutrality, as if he couldn't decide whether to admit his mistake or double down on his arrogance. Well, Harrison finally spoke, his voice louder than necessary, breaking the delicate silence that had settled over the room. That was unexpected. He chuckled softly, though the sound lacked its usual self-assurance. I guess talent really does come from the most unexpected places. The comment landed flatly. His companions exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. Clara tilted her head slightly, studying him. His words were meant as an olive branch, but they felt insincere, burdened by his inability to genuinely accept the moment. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice calm and measured. There was no warmth, but no hostility either. She wasn't going to let him pull her back into the smallness he had tried to impose. Her performance had already spoken louder than anything she could say. Harrison cleared his throat, clearly uneasy under the weight of the room's attention. He gestured for the waiter to bring him another drink, an attempt to regain his composure. "You've got quite the gift," he added, almost begrudgingly. Clara nodded once, her gaze steady. "Everyone has a gift," she said, her words purposeful. "It's how you choose to use it that matters." The room seemed to pause once again, the subtle sting of her words hanging in the air. It wasn't loud or confrontational, but it was enough to make an impact. Harrison shifted in his seat, his usual confidence slipping with each passing second. The diners slowly turned their attention back to their meals, but the energy in the room had completely changed. What had once been a quiet hum of privilege and arrogance now held something deeper, a shared recognition, perhaps even respect, for the waitress who had reminded everyone of the value of authenticity. But Harrison wasn't just embarrassed, he was exposed. No amount of charm could shield him from the truth that now lingered in the air. Clara stepped away from the piano, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. Her co-workers greeted her with quiet smiles and nods of approval as she returned to her station. She still had work to do, but something in her had changed. Her posture was straighter, her movements more assured. Harrison's table had fallen quiet. His group, who had laughed at her earlier, now avoided eye contact, their conversation subdued. The once loud air of superiority had evaporated, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable silence. The night went on, but Clara felt lighter. Every step she took through the room was more purposeful, her confidence blossoming in a way she hadn't anticipated. As she refilled glasses and cleared plates, patrons stopped her to offer kind words. "You're amazing," one older woman said gently as Clara set down a coffee cup. "I've never heard anything so moving." "Keep going," another man encouraged. "You've got something special. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." Clara thanked them with quiet humility, her heart swelling with gratitude. These weren't just compliments, they were affirmations of everything she had worked for, everything she had dreamed of becoming. Harrison, however, was not so gracious. As Clara approached his table to deliver the check, he looked up at her with a look that was somewhere between annoyance and reluctant admiration. "You've made your point," he said, his voice terse. "No need to rub it in." Clara paused, meeting his gaze directly. "It was never about proving anything to you," she replied, her voice steady but resolute. "I just wanted to play." Harrison had no response. He fidgeted with his drink, his once commanding presence reduced to an awkward shuffle. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone at the table knew it. As Harrison scribbled his signature on the check, one of his companions, a younger man with a gentler demeanor, looked at Clara and said, "You were incredible." "Truly." The sincerity in his voice took Clara by surprise, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of humanity in a group she had written off as superficial. "Thank you," she replied, offering a small smile before walking away. The night ended with Harrison and his group leaving quietly, their usual dramatic exit replaced by a hasty retreat. Clara watched them go, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness. She wasn't thinking about Harrison anymore. Her thoughts were already focused on the next step. The tips from that night were unusually generous, enough to cover her rent and leave a little extra for piano lessons she had been putting off. As she locked up and walked home, the cool evening air filling her lungs, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Certainty. She wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just a dreamer. She was an artist, and nothing, not the mocking words, not the financial struggles, not the fear, could take that away from her. But as she walked, her thoughts weren't on the night's confrontation. They were on the future, where her dreams finally felt closer than ever. Clara sat on the worn bench in her modest apartment, her fingers gliding over the keys of her old upright piano. The sound wasn't as crisp or rich as the grand piano at La Fontaine, but it didn't matter. The music came from her heart, just as it always had. That night, something changed within her. Not just a moment of triumph, but a realization that her talent wasn't something she needed to hide or justify. It was hers, and it was enough. In the days that followed, the events at the restaurant became something of a local story. Patrons who had witnessed her performance shared the tale, and word began to spread. A few days later, Clara received a call from a man who had been dining that night, a music producer visiting from Austin. He wasn't offering fame or fortune, but a chance to record a demo, a step toward something she had only dared to dream of. Clara agreed, not because she believed it would change her life overnight, but because it felt like a door opening, one she wasn't afraid to walk through. For years, she had let fear and doubt whisper lies into her mind, telling her she wasn't enough, that her dreams were too big. But now she saw the truth. Resilience and authenticity were Clara's greatest strengths. The incident with Harrison Blackwell wasn't just a humiliating spectacle turned victory. It was a reminder of the power of staying true to herself. Harrison, for all his wealth and arrogance, had nothing that could diminish her. He represented every voice of doubt she had ever faced, and she silenced him with nothing but the purity of her talent. To anyone who witnessed her story, Clara's message was clear. Never let someone else define your worth. The world is full of people like Harrison Blackwell, who project their insecurities onto others to feel powerful. But real strength comes from staying grounded in who you are and letting your passions speak louder than their ridicule. As she closed the piano lid and rested her hands on the worn wood, Clara smiled. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time it felt like it had truly begun. What about you? What dream have you been holding back because of fear or doubt? Don't wait for someone like Harrison to challenge you. Take your step forward now. If Clara's story inspired you, subscribe for more stories of resilience and triumph. Your story could be next.